Great. Well, welcome back to everybody. We had a very good initial session and discussion on these broad issues of the value of health for society. And of course, let me just reflect a bit on that, because with the pandemic, it's quite clear that the value that health has for economies, for society, is so huge. And indeed, there is a huge amount of discussion right now about how to make health system more resilient to crisis. And we have made, even at OECD, some heroic estimates of the additional investments that need to be made in the health system to make sure that we are much more resilient to crisis into the future, which come out really with numbers in the order of 1.4% of GDP additional investments the health system will need to make. At the same time, we've always argued, and we still believe that there is also significant waste in health systems, so areas in which perhaps we're not delivering the value that we would like to have it. So that's very much at the high level, and quite clearly right now the conversations are becoming very difficult because the economic situation is changing. Budgets are getting tighter again. I hear from countries that they say that they're struggling to convince Ministry of Finance to invest more in a health system to make sure that they are more resilient to crisis, because now the priorities are shifted to energy prices, to the cost of living crisis, to the war, and so forth. So this particular situation, which is challenging, is obviously going to affect also some of the discussion that were already quite difficult in the pharmaceutical sector. And when we're talking about value, we should recognize that there are also many different viewpoints. And no matter whether you ask the producer, the pharmaceutical industry, the patients, the regulator, or the payers, you will have a very different evaluation and assessment about the value. Everybody would agree, of course, very effective medicines needs to reach patients as soon as possible, because that's of high value to them and to society. But then going into really which type of products really generate that value. And more specifically, well, how do we price those products, and how do we assess the regulatory system in a way that makes sure that we can properly assess that value while making sure that we can have quick access. Though these issues are really not that simple to respond. And so if we look at some of the challenges, and there are huge debates actually at national level, but also at European and at global level, about the output of the industry and about prices that sometimes are difficult to justify. So I know that maybe for some of you this could be a little bit challenging as a proposition. But let me highlight some of the things that I hope will come up in the course of the discussion. The first, when we talk about value that medicines bring to patients, I think we need to also not to forget areas in which perhaps we don't have yet innovation, because that's the value for patients would be incredibly high, and still maybe we don't have enough innovations in those areas. Things about antibiotics, where we struggle to have new classes of antibiotics in the context of growing antimicrobial resistance, but think also of areas about mental health or pain. So the needs or the value for patients and for society is well known, but the rewards for industry from innovation in these areas is not as clear. And so there is an issue really here of values, like how do we make sure that perhaps we change the model that we have in a way that rewards innovation also on this area. There are also other areas, particularly in the issues related to oncology or immunology or certain rare diseases, where the discussions are very tense on a different front. Here we have lots of investment in innovations and lots of new products which are generated. So in a way, the productivity is very, very, very high. But there are lots of questions in some cases about the added value on some of these medicines, and also about the prices that these medicines command, particularly as we move more and more towards a situation where the products are increasingly more tailored to individual characteristics of a person, which is great, because obviously if we can have medicine that are really much more attuned to the specific also genomic or specific characteristics and profile of individual, that's fantastic. But it creates difficulties for the regulators that have perhaps to deal with a package of data to assess those products, which are incredibly smaller. So how do we do it? And it creates also issues in terms of evaluating what is the value added relative to existing products on the market. So the discussions is incredibly tense that I hear, between regulators, purchasers, and producers about, well, how do we value really those medicine, and what is a level of price which is a sufficient reward for innovators, but at the same time also reflects the additional added clinical value of those products. And it's not particularly easy to do it in the context also of the evidence being generated very early, or decisions needs to be for approval needs to come very early into the process when we don't sometimes have the full evidence. And there is discussions also about the contents and the model that we have of negotiations, which are confidential agreements, just creates a much more lack of trust between different players in the industry. So lots of questions here, which I'm sure that are going to be discussed by our panelists. But there is also like a frustration, which I see, which is growing from industry, about the lack of predictability from public payers about how much they are willing to pay for innovative products. Think when we had the hepatitis C that came to the market, huge, impressive products that really cures a terrible disease. But payers were just not ready, and they're still not ready for a sort of a black swan, that magic, really new innovations that come with extraordinary benefits for patients, but maybe needs to be applied to a very large number of patients themselves, and so it will cost to public payers. And how do we deal with this situation? And think if in the future, we're not there yet at all, but thinking in the future if we have a very innovative products for Alzheimer's disease, how are payers ready to pay for that products? How do we deal with this? So when we talk about this issue of value, we are really talking about also quite different things, whether we are referring to areas where there is no innovation whatsoever, whether we're talking areas in which there are lots of products, but questions about are the price, which are very high, justifiable, and also issues about those black swan. And in a context in which there are probably things that can be done in terms of regulation to simplify things, to make sure that we can have reduce the cost of regulations so that we can have a faster approval and harmonizations also of approval requirements. Think about opportunities in the European context as well that this may pose. So those are some of the issues that I want to say. I hope we can also reflect on this perhaps lack of trust that I see sometimes around, people having views which are quite different. How can we converge so that ultimately we can have the products which are really needed for patients, reach them as quick as possible, while also addressing those issues of financial viability that policymakers are dealing and struggling with. So with that, we have an extraordinary panel here, and really I'm very delighted to have them. They're much more experts on pharmaceutical issues and pharmaceutical markets than I am, so really very much looking forward to have a huge discussion. Let me introduce them. We have Thomas Allen, who is the Executive Director for Strategy and Healthcare Systems at EFIA. Welcome, Thomas. And Thomas has many years of experience working at EFIA, and he has also worked on a number of different topics with EFIA around the value-based agenda and issues. Welcome to you. We have Fabienne Bartoli, who is the Director General of the Haute Autorité de Santé in France, so the High Authority for Health in France. Welcome, Fabienne. Fabienne is an economist herself, has had many different roles, including advisors in government ministry officials, as a professor in innovation and pharmaceutical economics issues. So a very wide and broad perspective that Fabienne brings. We have Frank Lichtenberg, who is a kind brothers and company professors of healthcare management at Columbia University. So welcome to you, Frank. Frank has an absolutely impressive CV in terms not just of all the academic positions that he has had over the years, but also in terms of having testified to many committees and to Congress in the United States. He's the winner of many different prizes, Schumpeter prizes, award for distinguished economic research for many different papers, has worked with a variety of organizations as a consultant and advisor, and I was also struck by the fact that you advise the Walt Disney Company. I don't know whether that's on drugs and pharmaceutical or else, but a very impressive profile of advisory and academic role, so welcome to you. And then we have Dr. Jorge Padilla, who is a senior managing director and head of Compan's Lexicon EMEA. And again, Jorge has a distinguished career as an academic. He is the research fellow at the Center de Estudios Monetarios and Financieros. He teaches also at the Toulouse School of Economics. And he has, again, had a lot of testimony in different competition authorities and also relative to the European General Courts and UK competition appeals tribunal. Jorge also has an impressive long list of biography and a lot of research papers and books that has published. So we have, I think, the best really panel that we can hope for the discussion today. So I would like to move in with the question now, and the very first question is very general. Maybe each of you can respond in a short time, just a few minutes, but it's really I would like to get your perspective on this notion of value, in light also of what we heard in the previous discussion, the keynote speaker, the introduction, but also specifically to medicine. Is it really possible to really get and understand and assess the value the benefit brings to society? And if so, how should regulators or even payers take this perspective into account when they make then the decisions about what to approve or not and what to pay for or not? Are there pros and cons of different approaches? It's a very, very broad question, but feel free to reply the way you want about this notion of value. Maybe I'm going to start with women first. So Fabienne, over to you.
So thank you, Francesca, and thank you for inviting me here today. Yeah, maybe to answer you very shortly at your first question, I have just one slide to make a little the path of medicine in France, and you can see how we measure the value of a new medicine in different perspectives. Of course, the first one is the common one in the European Union with assessment of benefits risk, as you know, as everyone know here, and just to know what kind of indication we want to have with these new products. And the second step, it's at the national level, it's our institution, and so we going to measure what we call the health technologies assessment. That means the clinical benefits that we call medical added value for physicians and patients. For clinical added value, so we have two criteria, one based on clinical benefits at all. For an example, the paracetamol medicines have a very high clinical benefit, but a very little clinical added value because it's a generic since years and years. And then we can combine these two kinds of assessment to measure the value of a new medicine. So you can have a very new product, a real innovation, but with very little medical added value. So And at the contrary, like my former example, you can have a very old product with a very high clinical added value. And then sometimes we measure also the health economics value, but it's only for the breakthrough innovation or very important products, I mean, in public health perspective, like vaccine, for example, of course, or others, where we make special assessment and special reports to measure this value. And then after, it's not us, it's the government, so it's better for us. There are the price negotiation that's between ministry and the national health insurance, because we have only one. So with a special committee who make the negotiation. And sometimes it's here, it takes a little bit time when we didn't find the real value to the new medicines. So.
Perfect. Thank you. Maybe I'll go on to Frank now about these issues of value. And I hear sometimes, well, value should also include the indirect additional benefits that a medicine can bring in terms of improved productivity for the people that take the medicine, if they can go back to work and so forth. Do you have any perspective on this notion of value?
Okay, well, thank you. I apologize for my voice. I managed to pick up a cold when I went to Mallorca the last few days, but so I hope you'll be able to understand me. Well, I mean, one question that arises when assessing value is what kinds of data are we going to use? And there's this big distinction in the literature between RCT and RWE, that is randomized clinical trials, which are kind of the gold standard for drug approval, and real-world evidence, because drugs may not be used in the real world, and they may have different effects in the real world than what appears in clinical trials. I have to say that I don't do clinical trials, but I do analyze real-world evidence. And in terms of assessing value, well, what are the elements of value? I would say we want to measure outcomes. And the best measured outcome, and perhaps the most important one, is longevity or mortality. And that's relatively easy to measure, because death is kind of a binary thing, either you're dead or alive. But in addition to that, we certainly care about quality of life, health-related quality of life and disability, and that's really quite multidimensional. I don't think there's any really one single index for measuring quality of life, so we really have to rely on a number of different indicators. We can ask people whether they have difficulty engaging in activities of daily living or instrumental activities of daily living, whether they can live independently, and so on. We can also look at administrative data, as I did in a study of the United States I did earlier this year, where we can look at, for example, whether people are collecting Social Security benefits, disability benefits from the government. And in that study, I found that when there is more innovation for a disease, that the probability that someone with that disease is less likely to be disabled and to be collecting disability payments from the government. So I think that those are very important elements of value. But in addition, we should think about potential cost offsets. And so a new drug may appear to be expensive, but if it reduces the need for other medical care, especially hospital care and maybe home health care and other types of medical care, then that should be factored in. And I think that frequently is not contemplated. We may generally not have the data from randomized clinical trials. We don't follow patients long enough to see whether they are hospitalized or not for the disease. But I think that that's quite important, and I've done a number of studies that look at that. And one last thing I'll say is another impact of innovation might be what Schumpeter, we heard about Schumpeter earlier, called creative destruction. That is, when new drugs enter the market, that can reduce the demand and, in fact, the price of old drugs. And I have shown that that is true both in the United States, which has the highest drug prices in the world, and in Denmark, which has the lowest drug prices in Europe. And so again, when we think about what is the net cost of this new medicine, we should recognize that the introduction of that medicine may in fact have spillover effects and reduce the costs of other types of medical care.
Thank you so much. Jorge, over to you. What's your perspective on this notion of value? We heard quite eloquently on the value really that medicines bring to society, but would you agree with what Frank said?
Yeah, I agree with everything that has been said, and I would like to put it in context and then talk a little bit about price in relation to value. So I think that we have heard that value is multidimensional. Value concerns the value of a new medicine relates to its impact on medical and health outcomes, and I fully agree with that. And then we have heard also that there are some macroeconomic spillovers. A new drug may have an impact on competition between different types of drugs that are aimed at addressing a particular therapeutical condition. And then we have heard that there are macroeconomic externalities or spillovers, in the sense that a new drug may, by increasing the quality of life, by reducing the incidence of illness, increase productivity, increase, therefore, economic growth, and it may have also impact public finances to the extent that it reduces other forms of expenditure. Now, the bridge with prices. Some people said a long time ago, and I don't remember exactly who said that economists know the price of everything and the value of nothing. And I think that that's absolutely false, because there is no way that you can price without having an idea about the value of the product that you are trying to price. If you think about a new drug, ideally what you would want is to set a price that is related to the incremental value of that technology, of that medicine, over and above the existing ones. And that incremental value is, in a sense, or should direct, in a sense, or influence the willingness to pay of whatever health system for that new drug. Now, we understand that that's not exactly the best proxy of the willingness to pay for two reasons. One is that, in fact, most people don't have any willingness to pay for anything, and they will want to get the product without having to pay for it. But now, more seriously, because if you have to devote public resources to pay for a certain drug, there is an opportunity cost. You may not be able to use those public resources to pay for other things that may have to do with education, defense systems, etc., etc. So there is a shadow price of the funding of these new medicines. And that's something that you need to take into account. And that's going to define kind of an upper bound and a lower bound. Ideally, you would want the upper bound is the incremental value of this drug relative to the next best alternative. The lower bound is going to have that minus the shadow price of that new drug, which is related to the opportunity cost of the money that you spend on that drug. And then is when there is a negotiation. And I think that we would need to talk, and we are going to talk, I believe, next, or at some point during this panel, about how that negotiation should proceed. Now, prices that are above the incremental value of the next best alternative are likely to be deemed excessive, if not by the competition agencies, by somebody else. Prices that are below the incremental value of the next best alternative over the next best alternative minus this shadow price that I defined before are insufficient, in my opinion. Now, I think that, unfortunately, from the viewpoint of innovation, we tend to see prices that are below the ideal lower bound, and only in few occasions we see prices above the ideal upper bound, and those tend to be also captured by the competition agencies. So we need to define that range, think about that range, and then talk about what are the optimal institutions to fix a price between those two bounds that I define briefly in the few minutes that we have available here.
Great, thank you so much. And Thomas, do you agree? So are we there to have this up and lower level prices and this range? Are we there yet or not quite yet? What's your perspective from?
Well, maybe, and first of all, thanks so much for the invitation to this panel, which I think is very timely and important. And I think we heard very well in the introduction to the conference on the value of health, and COVID really taught us that, and the societal value of investing in health. And I think that we might not be there yet in terms of consensus, but I think we are certainly moving in that direction. But of course, we have in Europe, which is compared to United States, a very kind of fragmented system in terms of how we view value, how we assess value. And of course, that creates challenges, and it creates challenges for all of us, for the health systems and for the industry, which, as you said in the beginning, also the industry needs some kind of predictability. The pharmaceutical companies need to know what is valued, what will health systems pay for, and then that is what drives investment. Or at least you have to be able to guess it. And then, of course, it's driven by science, but by investment. I think on value, and I think a lot of very good things were said. We like to think, when we're talking about value to whom, and we like to think in terms of sort of patient value, value to health systems, and value to the broader society. So, of course, patient value is in the center. We innovate for patients. And that is, of course, survival, yes, is the ultimate. But we have the quality of life, being able to go back to work, take part in social life, etc. And also just kind of patient satisfaction with the treatment. Some treatments have side effects or are very cumbersome to take. That's also part of, for patients, what value is. Then, of course, we have the kind of health system value. So what are the cost offsets? If you can prevent people from going to hospital, you sort of save resources, or you put less pressure on hospitals. I think there's a figure, I think it's from the OECD actually, that where I think you say that every year Europe loses around 125 billion because of lack of adherence to kind of common treatments for chronic diseases, cardiovascular, diabetes. Patients for different reasons don't take the treatments, so they unnecessarily have to go to emergency visits, primary care, hospitalization, complications, etc. So that is clearly very, very costly. And then we have the broader societal value. That's what I've talked about. Patients can go back to work. Also, their families can go back to work in some cases. And I think that all these things can be assessed. We need different methods. Some things are more challenging to assess than others. And I think, you talked about, for instance, you mentioned, pain and other neurological conditions. Some of these unmet needs and disease areas where we don't always have treatments today. We need the patients to help us measure them. We need patient-reported outcomes to understand some of these diseases and what the value is. And sometimes, here can be a difference between different health agencies in different countries. How do they view patient-reported outcomes? What's seen as a robust outcome? Can we trust them? And some regulators tend to prefer the hard clinical outcomes that you can measure, it's mortality, et cetera, et cetera. So there we need to do more. And you also mentioned Alzheimer's, which I agree is going to be a big challenge. Of course, at the start of that challenge, it's a huge hope and opportunity to actually get effective medications, or at least medications that are more effective than the ones we have today, which basically don't do much at all. And of course, this would be a huge hope for the patients and their families. And yes, of course, This will come with a cost. I mean, the current treatments for Alzheimer's are generics, just treat some of the symptoms. But a new treatment that would really slow down the progression of Alzheimer's, which would be a huge breakthrough, would of course come with a cost. But already today, Alzheimer's costs in Europe around, I have the figure here, 232 billion euros every year in health and social care costs. So yeah, we have a cost of disease, and new treatments can help offset part of that cost. And a big chunk of the Alzheimer's cost today is social care, so not even healthcare, but social care. So we need to be able to look at different buckets of public spending to really understand the full value.
Sure, and I think though the challenge still remains, I mean, for regulators and payers, if we agree that there are those broader values that innovative medicines, novel, not just novel, but really truly innovative medicines bring to society, also in terms of the indirect effects, should those then be included into the price? Because if we include it also into the assessment, it may also false, in a way, the evaluation of the added clinical value. So, to what extent should those indirect benefits for society be really captured into the price, and the way the assessment is made remain an issue? I can see you, but can we, very, very quick, because I would like to move on to something.
Okay, I just wanted to comment on a couple of things Thomas said. First of all, non-adherence is a problem. In a study I did with my colleague Katerina Blanker, we showed a couple of years ago that patients tend to be more adherent to newer drugs than they are to older drugs. In a more recent study, we show that new drugs are less likely to be used off-label than older drugs. So those are two advantages of innovation. They increase adherence and they reduce off-label use, which is costly. And regarding Alzheimer's, even though the search for an Alzheimer drug has been pretty difficult, and now there might be one, I have some evidence that innovation has reduced cognitive impairments, and that could be a spillover effect, because if a person has diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and so forth, they are at risk to have cognitive impairment, and therefore better management of those diseases can reduce the risk of cognitive impairment and maybe even Alzheimer's.
Great, thank you. Can I move on to something slightly different? So, we have these issues of how to value and how to incorporate that broader value into price. I don't think we probably remain with somehow different views between the regulator and industry, and I think that deserves much more debate to really get closer to more of an agreement. But there is another issue that has been alluded to in the discussions, which is the issue also of early access and ensuring that there is early access also to treatment. And we are now witnessing, a new possible regulation, HTA regulations, that really will try to assess the additional clinical benefits of new pharmaceuticals for the whole EU. So really, in a way, that could replace also some of the assessment procedures in individual countries. So perhaps, potentially, this could also lead to earlier access for medicines, including in some countries in which, at the moment, access takes place later. I wonder, maybe I'll go again to Fabienne and to you, Thomas. What's your perspective on these health technology assessment regulations and the potential benefits that it might have, but also some perhaps of the issues from your perspective? Yes.
Yeah, of course, we hope to make, briefly, we hope to make something like we made in the 90s with the European medicine agencies at the beginning. That means that we're going to try with this new regulation to, with colleagues of other countries, have joint HTA production, and we want we'll be focused on clinical aspects on HTA to have an homogeneic assessment at the European level, and no add layers and layers. Of course, we hope thanks to this new regulation, to make an earlier access for the patient to the products and to the better products, the best products. So that's the big perspective. And so for doing this, we hope to have a joint HTA between us until 2025, because it's the time we have to make common methods for the basis for the European Union members. And then after, of course, we leave the appraisal to the national level, of course.
And do you think there is a role for this regulation or regulation more broadly to really accelerate market access and reduce perhaps the cost of R&D? Do you think that that's...
I mean, it will be a consequence, of course, because if you can have better evaluation, a better assessment at the beginning with less time to go to the market and to the patients, of course it will be reduce the R&D and maybe reduce, I don't know, but hoping using this money to make some post-market studies with real life data that we need to have them, and at this moment we have not a lot of real life data for assess the products.
Excellent. Thomas, you work at the European Association as well. Do you have perspective as well on this new European regulation on HTA? Will it bring good things in terms of faster access and reducing also some of the cost of regulation?
Well, I think it has to, or it has been a big failure. I mean, this was, why it was made, and also why FBI, why the industry was a warm supporter of this proposal to have a joint clinical assessment at EU level. Just for the reasons I talked about in the beginning, today we have a fragmented system. We have a joint market approval, as Fabienne already went through, but then there are 27 different systems for assessing the clinical value, economic value, and then pricing. And this was supposed to be a way to create a more unified system of the first part, the clinical assessment, while the kind of health economic assessment and pricing stays at member state level. So for us, we saw this as streamlining, simplifying the process, creating more joint assessments, and making it easier and faster for the industry to file for access for pricing reimbursement in many countries, because this is a very cumbersome process and where you need to know exactly the system of each country, and they want different evidence, different data, so this takes a lot of time and resources. But I think so this is a huge hope. But I think the proof is in the pudding, and we haven't yet seen the full pudding because it's still kind of in the oven. Because one thing is the regulation has been adopted, but now it's going to be implemented, and basically, Fabienne and her colleagues in all the countries sit down and try to figure out what's the methodology, what kind of evidence do we need, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this is where we are. Well, of course, we don't have a full view of this, but our, let's say, concern is that the result will not be as kind of harmonized and streamlined as we hoped it would be, but rather more kind of an amalgamation of already existing evidence requirements in different countries put together in one big pile, which doesn't really simplify much. And I fully understand the challenges. So I used.
You're suggesting like throwing away everything and redoing from scratch? Or?
I mean, from scratch is a tall order maybe, but But I think, I mean, here's the thing, and I fully understand the challenges, and you know, in my previous life, I used to work for a government, for a health ministry, and of course, it is the case that, especially in health, I think, that every country tends to think that we do it best. You know, we have the best system for everything, and we can teach all the other countries how to do things. And I think this is where you have where all the countries want to keep doing basically what they have been doing earlier, and they still want to use their favorite comparator, that is standard of care in their country, for instance. But if you just add all this up, of course you create a very complex system that might not be the kind of simplification and streamlining that at least we were hoping for, and that we think that patients are hoping for, because that's really the measure of success. Will patients get faster access to innovative treatments across Europe, and not only in some?
Sure, and it's definitely not easy to get to this streamlining, but I get the point. And I think, I mean, many of you did mention the issues of this evidence and, you know, the improvement of the evidence base. And Frank, you really alluded to at the very beginning of your introduction as well, you know, the using real-world evidence as a way really to inform decision on coverage and reimbursement. But, you know, in practical terms, are we there yet in some country? Are we there yet in the United States? And what can be done really to make sure that we improve this evidence base so that we can have also faster, perhaps, coverage and pricing and reimbursement decisions?
Well, I think that there ought to be more systematic assessment. We don't really do HTA in the United States. The government doesn't do it. There is a committee that undertakes that kind of analysis, but it's not really performed systematically. And so I think you know, a much more aggressive effort to perform those kinds of analyses would be very helpful. You know, in terms of access, and you may hear a little bit more about this tomorrow. You know, I think in general, economists believe that new products tend to be of higher quality than old products. I mean, there are some very good old products, old drugs, but new drugs are on average better than old drugs. And so one of the best summary measures of a population's access to drugs is what I call the mean vintage of drugs. Like, let's say I go into your medicine excuse me, I go into your medicine cabinet, I look at the bottles of pills, and I ask, when was that drug invented? Was that drug invented in 1950, in 1990, or in 2020? I think that that's a very meaningful indicator that a drug invented in 2020 is likely to be a better drug than a drug invented 50 years ago. And so we can, and if there's poor access to new drugs, then people will be taking old drugs, and the vintage of their drugs will be quite old. So I think that's an effective way of measuring access.
Yeah, and I agree. At the same time, on the issues of the old drugs, I mean, there are some old drugs that are completely unavailable any longer because basically there is no longer any incentives to produce them, and still they are in demand. And there have been really problems at least in some European countries, about shortage of drugs, of really some really needed drugs, because somehow they were not there, not produced there anymore. So I guess there is still a demand for some old drugs that are very effective, but somehow they're not anymore, priced in a way that are of any interest.
The average drug that people are taking is about 35 years old. So if we look at what drugs people are taking today, in the United States, they would be from the 1980s.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Jorge, I may go back to a more maybe theoretical issues, because we talk a lot about the regulator, and the question is more perhaps a rhetorical one, or to you to elaborate. Is there really need to have an economic regulator at a country level? So for pricing issues and for reimbursement purposes, that is independent from the seller and the buyers, given the fact that we have a public or quasi-monopsony in the prescription market. Do we really need to have that?
Yeah, well, this is a difficult question, and I think that there are arguments in favor and against. My personal view is that we don't need, but what we need is to have rules for the regulator that is at the same time a purchaser and therefore possesses monopsony power. So, as I mentioned before, in terms of in thinking about how to translate value into prices, you need to think about this upper bound that I defined before, the incremental value over the next best alternative. I think that having the government involved, if that is what the way that prices take place in that economy, if there is some centralized regulation, is good, because that would allow, when measuring the incremental value of the technology, to look not only at the direct benefits, but also to all the indirect benefits that we have been discussing before, the benefits to society in general. I think it's optimal to negotiate with a regulator that represents the government preferences, because that is the one that is going to internalize the opportunity cost of those funds, and therefore is going to tell us what is the shadow cost of the money that is being spent in the drugs. But of course, what we need to make sure is that we avoid some of the pitfalls of negotiating with a local government. One being that it may have short-term preferences that are related to the electoral cycle. Other that it may decide to free ride on innovation because it feels that other countries are the ones that are going to borne the effort of funding the innovation. And therefore, I think it is important that the rules of the game are clear, that constrains the scope of the negotiation, that we understand what is a legitimate lower bound given the definition of the incremental value of the drug over the next best alternative. That we therefore have some degree of predictability on what are going to be what is the likely result of that negotiation, because it is predictability that will have a positive impact on innovation. There is one last comment I would like to make in this regard, and this is a comment from a European perspective. There is a question as to whether you want to do the negotiation at the country level, at the member state level, or at the union level. And again, there are pros and cons. On the one hand, if you think about what is the shadow cost of the money, that may be very different across member states because they may be in very different fiscal positions. But at the same time, I think that one of the concerns that I have with the current situation is that really some member states free ride on others and on the world economy in general, on also non-EU countries, and that this free riding has a negative impact on innovation. If every country in the world considers that its marginal contribution to the funding of innovation is small, then innovation won't take place. And I think that therefore that militates in favor of having at least some guidance at the EU level about where the price bands should be for different types of drugs, so that we don't move necessarily from a supranational EU-based agency that decides which medicines are approved to a situation in which then the negotiation about price is left altogether and without any guidance to the member states.
Great. So you mentioned a couple of very important points. One is these issues of predictability, which obviously I agree. I mean, industry needs to be predictability. Is this lack of predictability linked really to the political cycle or to some structural problems in the way the market works and in the way perhaps we have set the rules of the game altogether? Is it really linked to a change in the government that's lead, or is it something that across different level of governments we have really seen that there is a lack of predictability for industry in understanding what payers would be willing to pay or not? So
my understanding is that the problems of predictability that we face today are due to the absence of any rules or guidance about how pricing is going to take place. And so, I think that what we observe is basically, unfettered negotiations, unconstrained negotiations in which there is no obvious rule, no boundaries, and therefore it's just a question about who can leverage, better and more credibly, who can threaten more credibly, whether the regulator threatening not to pay or the pharmaceutical company threatening not to provide access. And I think that that's utterly unsatisfactory. I think that we need some guidance and some rules. I mean, of course, we're going to live in a world of risk and uncertainty, as Antón Costas was mentioning before. That's no doubt. But what we should avoid is the regulatory uncertainty or the sources of regulatory uncertainty that we can control. And I think that having more guidance about how those negotiations should proceed, what are reasonable boundaries, what type of also considerations are going to be taken into account. Are we going to look at non-linear prices? For example, what kind of discounts are, and volume discounts and retroactive discounts are permitted? Are we going to have dynamic pricing? You mentioned at the outset that there is uncertainty as to what is going to be the value of the medicine when the medicine is initially launched. How can we adapt up and down, and what is the process by which these revisions take place in a way that is non-opportunistic? And I think that, if you look at other areas of economic regulation, like telecoms and energy, we have been, with all the problems that we still face, we have been making progress. Whereas here, I think that I have the feeling, maybe incorrect, that this is still a blank slate, that we are leaving the pricing of these drugs to who has leverage in a particular negotiation, and that's unsatisfactory from my viewpoint.
Why can't we rely on market competition to discipline prices?
That if we had a system in which the government didn't intervene in prices, then we would be able to see what people are prepared to pay, and then we would be doing analysis based on comparables, because then the market would tell us what people are prepared to do. Unfortunately, or fortunately, because there are pros and cons, I think that that's not the situation in which we live on this side of the Atlantic, unfortunately.
Great, thank you. I would like to move on into a slightly different things that I was alluding in my interventions, which is really the issues of innovations in areas of high unmet needs, but where perhaps incentives from industry are not as high. And I mentioned antibiotics, but there could be other areas. Thomas, I wonder if you have perspective on that. Why don't we manage to innovate in some areas where there is a clear need from society and from patients?
Yes, so this is a very good and complicated question. And I think first we need to understand that no unmet need is like the other. So we really have to drill down what is the unmet need and analyze. So there's not sort of a silver bullet answer to that question. So you have unmet needs like, well, let's say Alzheimer's, where it's just a very challenging area, medically, scientifically. We have some ideas of our Alzheimer's work. We're trying these different targets. When the clinical trial fail, there's a discussion, is it because the drug wasn't put in early enough in a patient? So how do we diagnose patients early enough? Or is the disease target wrong? Is the basic science wrong? And it sort of comes with the territory that, and that's also how sort of medical science, how the progression works, that we have sort of done all the easy stuff, and we have a lot of so the industry is moving into harder and harder areas, like Alzheimer's. But here, clearly, the industry is continuing to invest in, so that's not the problem, and they're investing even though clinical trials are failing. So there's sort of the industry model clearly works. Then we have other unmet needs. You mentioned AMR, antibiotics, where there is, the very specific sort of market failure of we want to invent a new drug that we're not supposed to use, right? So if we if we get a new antibiotic that can deal with all the, or some of the multi-resistant bacteria, we shouldn't use it until the last resort. And the normal business model doesn't work with that because it's based on sales. So we need to find another business model. And EFIA has proposals for that now because not only here in Spain is the pharmaceutical rules up for revision, but also at European level, the European Commission has already started and will soon launch a huge revision of the entire European pharmaceutical legislation. And this we see as a big opportunity to do a number of things: modernize the regulatory framework, make sure that Europe stays competitive, because globally we're actually slipping in R&D compared to other regions, the US, now China, other regions. And we want to get back to the top. So it's a huge opportunity. One of those is to create a new incentive for AMR. Our specific proposal is what we call a transferable exclusivity extension. I'm not going to get into the details, but it's basically the reward you would get in terms of incentives for AMR that you can't use because you won't sell it. You can transfer to another product or sell to another company. So that would be, according to our calculations, the most effective way to do that. But then there's, of course, a discussion and assess the different models. So, but there we need something very specific. There are, of course, other unmet needs, like the really, really rare diseases, what we should call ultra-rare diseases, where it's just a handful of patients. I think when it comes to the, let's say, normal rare diseases, the current orphan drug regulation that we have in the EU is working, has produced a tremendous amount of results for most rare disease patients. But then we have the really ultra-rare diseases, and there often the problem is not just the kind of business model, the economic incentives. It's usually a scientific problem in the beginning. You don't even know how the disease works, and you only have 10 patients. So the science isn't there, often the regulatory system isn't there, and then of course the economics isn't there. And here we need completely new types of models, more type of public-private partnership type models where you sit together and try to figure out how can we together solve the scientific issues, the regulatory issues, the data issues, the clinical research issues, and the economic model. So there, new types of moonshot type approaches are needed, or at least a very robust public-private partnership, which we, by the way, have in Europe in terms of the innovative health initiative
in Europe. Great, thank you. Look, we have covered a lot of grounds. I have a last question, which, before seeing if there are questions from the floor, which I would like to pose to everybody, which is really more this issue of how to create better dialogue between industry, governments, regulators. I think fundamentally we all agree on the issues that investing in health and having innovative medicines is good for society. When we then go to the more practical issues of how do we really assess, how do we price this, and how quickly those take place, how do we streamline the regulation across different countries and so forth, it all comes to difficulties and sometimes also different positions. And, there's a lot of discussions also at European level about these issues of lack of transparency and how do we create much more transparent markets to perhaps as a way to make sure that we build or rebuild the level of trust across different players. And I wonder if each of you has a perspective on this issue of dialogue between industry, between regulators, between payers as well. Do we really see a lack of trust right now, and what could be done perhaps to rebuild that trust? Maybe I'll start, Fabienne, with you.
Okay, first, of course, it's to put some common rules known by everyone. And the first one, of course, is transparency. It's quite simple, but not so simple to put in place in the real life and the everyday life of our institution. For example, we met in France, we set up in France some videos, some registrations, some of all dialogues. And so we put in all our commission, of course, also all the people who have to know about the process. That means the users, not only the patients, because you can be a future users and have a point of view about how the debates are made for the evaluation, for assessment process and everything. So I think this transparency is very important to put more trust in the system, or more confidence between all the players. If I think.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. And who wants to go? Yes, Jorge wants to go first.
Very briefly, I mentioned before that, in my view, the price that should result from the negotiation should take into account the incremental value of the drug and should take into account what is the cost of the funds, that the alternative, the opportunity cost. There are fundamental asymmetries of information when calculating those figures. In terms of the incremental value of the drug, it may be that the industry have better information than the regulator, and that makes the regulator suspicious. On the opportunity cost of the funds, of course, is the government. They has, what they can afford and how much then is the government. So I think that we need to try to reduce these asymmetries of information so that we can get to more productive negotiations. And the second comment that I would make is that when negotiating about price, you need people that care about price and are talking about price and look at it as a matter of money exclusively. One of the problems that I think that occurs in this industry is that people bring moral values to the negotiating table. And when you bring moral issues to the negotiating table, then negotiation is always pretty difficult. If you want to ruin a negotiating process, make sure that you characterize like the other guy, like the evil, greedy guy, or the lazy, unwilling to pay guy, and then you won't get very far. So if it's money, let's talk about money.
Frank.
Well, I think I heard the term transparency used once or twice, and while everyone seems to think transparency is like motherhood and apple pie, and that everybody ought to know everything. There is some economic literature that suggests that certain kinds of transparency may not be desirable, and particularly about prices. Now, this may be less relevant to the European market than it is to the United States, but that literature suggests that if there's competition in a market, when there are numerous producers of a drug for a disease, for example, if every firm knows what the other firm is charging, then there is likely to be less intense competition than if there are private negotiations. That secrecy, for example, can lead to larger rebates on drugs, and therefore transparency is not necessarily as good as you might think. So I would just add that note.
Great, thank you, Thomas.
Yes, dialogue. Yeah, no, we absolutely need more dialogue and real dialogue, and we need to create those for us when that can be held. I mean, of course, when one pharma company meets a pricing and reimbursement authority, that's not a dialogue, that's a negotiation, that's something else. But we need a more system-wide dialogue. And I think that there is certainly a momentum for it. I think COVID actually created a huge momentum. I mean, normally, there are all types of, constraints around what kind of meetings can you have and how often can you have them. But, when and about what. But when COVID-19 hit, and in the first months when there was a crisis, there was, of course, a vaccine was far off. There were shortages, as you mentioned, when different countries started to actually raise barriers in Europe and have export restrictions on medicines that were needed for intensive care, etc. Then we, the European Commission, European Medicines Agency, they set up meetings with us every week, at least. Not just FBR Medicines for Europe, so the generic sector, the whole supply and value chain, just to check what's happening, what kind of drugs do you have in stock, where are they, why, where are there shortages, why, what can we do to fix it, and there was really kind of what are the solutions, and we all wanted to solve the issue. So we could say that, well, these clinical trials have been disrupted. Can you adopt some new guidelines that can make them work in a remote setting? Countries are creating shortages by raising barriers. Can you create blue lanes through borders that medicines can get through, etc. So then we all got in a solutions mode, and that created actually built trust and showed the value of sitting down together and just say, what are the problems, how can we solve them? And then you can have different interests in that, but you know where you're coming from. So I think that is something we need to build on and bring into the more normal, normal healthcare environment. And I think one good way to start, on the topic of transparency is horizon scanning. What's coming in the R&D pipeline, and I think we talked about hepatitis C earlier, and those drugs that came that were super effective. They came with a cost. Most payers were like, oh, we can't pay for this. And I think with just a bit of foresight and horizon scanning, everyone could have seen, well, this will come in a few years. How do we plan for it? And sit down with the industry. When is it coming? Of course, company by company, because as you mentioned, you can't disclose business secrets. But see, what do you have coming? And start planning for that, which is more about pricing and budgets. It's about the whole health system. Is the healthcare organization there, the patient pathways, etc. So that's a very good way to start. And I think we need to set up more of these forums and platforms for dialogue. And we were very happy to contribute, for instance, to the WHO Europe initiatives to set up this Oslo Medicines Initiative on better access to innovative medicines in Europe, where you can sit with member states, with governments, all stakeholders, and just discuss what are the key issues, how do we solve them, because that's ultimately how we're going to solve better access and better value assessments in all European countries, because it's sort of a country by country issue and sort of therapy area by therapy area almost, and you need to get down into the details.
Great, thank you. So a note of hope. I wonder if there are questions. I can hardly see. There's a lot of light on me, but I wonder if there are any questions. I can see over there. I don't know if there's a mic that we can.
Tanto de medicina humana como de veterinaria tendrían que estar en consideración en el sentido tanto a nivel de farmaindustria como en cualquier tipo de producción farmacológica. Es decir, los medicamentos veterinarios en general son aproximadamente el triple más caros que los medicamentos de humano. Eso provoca que muchos animales no reciban un tratamiento adecuado. Entonces, además de este problema que no se ha tocado, aún cuando se habla de una ponencia de medicamentos y el valor social de invertir en sanidad, según nuestro concepto, involucra tanto a la medicina humana como la medicina veterinaria y el medio ambiente. Si hablamos de One Health. Ahora, mi pregunta va para Francesca, ¿vale? Y Fabienne, ¿vale? Ambas dos.
don't have.
Consideración respecto a la posición de los medicamentos veterinarios que sean dispensados por farmacéuticos o por veterinarios. Entiendo que en Francia lo hacen los veterinarios. Sin embargo, a nivel de la Unión Europea se han establecido diferentes formas de dispensación. En España, lamentablemente, en la dispensación de los medicamentos los hace los farmacias y las tiendas online. Algo que no es meramente lógico, debido a que el conocimiento, lamentablemente, de los farmacéuticos es básicamente de medicina de humanos. No están, en teoría, preparados para dispensar y dar una buena calidad de servicio en lo que se refiere a medicamentos veterinarios. Quiero saber vuestra posición en ese sentido y qué medidas consideran que podrían tomar en relación a la actual ley española que todavía está en ciernes de corregir y modificar tanto la ley de medicamento en general, que incluye la alemana, como la veterinaria.
Right. So I might have lost a little bit of your question, but basically about medicine in the Mediterranean vet sector. I must say that at OECD we're not really looking at that, so it's very difficult for me. But I don't know whether that comes also in the realm of your responsibilities as well.
Of course, it's not. Yes, sorry, it's another agency in France who are in charge of the veterinarian medicines, but yeah, it's quite a complete different system, mainly in the agricultural sector. I mean, with people who make I forget the name in English. The éleveurs. It's yeah, people who care about animals for feeding, and so they in France that they are the veterinarian who sell the veterinary products also. It's like in Spain, so no, it's not. So yeah, in France it's the veterinarian who sell it. They prescribe and they sell the product in the same.
Yeah, and I will not be able to comment on how fast. But there are, look, as a consequence, there are a lot of hands now up. So I wonder, shall I go here? Who was, okay, well, Mike is going around. Okay.
Yes, I have a question for Frank and Jorge. Both of you mentioned very clearly the very strong positive externalities or the direct and indirect benefits of all the savings. And I know, Frank, you've done a lot of research on this, a lot of academic research. So my question is, how can we do better at making this information public and collecting it at the international level, having national and international data collection on these additional benefits that pharmaceutical innovation brings about? And related to that, this question of the opportunity cost that Jorge mentioned. Here in Spain, before the pandemic, the investment in the health system was around 6.5%, which is definitely lower, at least 2 percentage points lower than the average in the OECD and the EU. So my question, do you think this is too low? And what would be an appropriate level for investment in the health system in Spain?
In all health systems, not just in pharma. All right, okay, going to you, Frank and Jorge.
Well, I don't want to shirk the responsibility, but you guys have the communication consultants and so forth working for you. I think you might be in a much better position to say, how can we disseminate these ideas? How can we convince policymakers and regulators to pay attention to the social value, the cost offsets? It's a challenge. I've been doing this kind of research for 30 years, and certainly there's often a very enthusiastic audience within the industry, but getting sort of beyond the industry, that is more difficult. So perhaps you have ideas about that.
Well, I think I would add that there are studies for certain types of conditions about the cost to society. I think that, for example, I think Francesca was mentioning mental health. I think that in the UK, for example, there have been very significant and valuable studies about what is the impact of depression and other conditions, other mental health conditions on the performance of the economy and so on. And I think that what we need to do is to translate that into the pricing negotiation, is to bring those costs that can be mitigated with certain drugs into the negotiating table. Now, that's something that who's going to do? I think that is the seller who has to do, by and large. You would think that perhaps the regulator, if it's a public institution that cares about the macroeconomy, should do, but I would expect that it's the seller, as I think that Frank was implying, that has to do that, and it has to do that in a rigorous fashion so that that is taken properly into account. There is an asymmetry of information that I was mentioning before, but it's not impossible. I mean, I'm not claiming that everything can be quantified. You may know the story about the guy that was asked what is the meaning of life and said 42. So that's quite irrelevant. Not everything can be quantified, but there are certain things that can be quantified, and the impact of certain illnesses and conditions on productivity can be quantified, and then but it's incumbent on those that want to use that information for the benefit in the pricing negotiation to bring that to the negotiating table.
And here we'll play a little bit of advocate devil, if I may, because I completely agree. At the same time, who should appropriate themselves of those values? Should it be the producer of pharma? Should it not be maybe, if you talk about a GP, it saves so many lives. Should not a GP be paid so much more? Or even, at the hospital that saves a lot of life and therefore has a huge indirect benefits to society. And so the question goes on how this pie of the indirect benefits and the value, how should be divided between different players? It's not an indifferent one. So I agree with your reasoning, but I also question, should really this be part of the higher prices of the drugs? Then how about all the other inputs that go into the production on health? How about the health professionals, which arguably are not paid enough, particularly GPs? And definitely those are some of the issues that do require much more broader discussions. But, I just to put here, and I see that you raise your hands. Yes, please, and quick response. And then I see also that there are, over there, yeah.
Very quick comments. Notice that I mentioned incremental value over the next best alternative. So this is trying to capture the value of the drug, other things equal, because the next best alternative also has to be used by hospitals, has to be used by, and it will require the contribution of the professionals, etc. And there is a challenge in measuring the incremental value, but that's important. Now, the second comment, sometimes you have complementarities. It's absolutely impossible to think about or to disentangle what is the incremental value of the drug because cannot be separated from other contributions. That's challenging, but again, nothing new under the sun. If you think about it, that's exactly what we do when we try to determine how much should be, or what should be the level of the royalties that you will attribute to the owners of technologies in your cellular phone relative to the rents that go to the OEM, the original equipment manufacturer, Apple or whoever, et cetera, et cetera.
But I think we will debate. I still go back to the issue that GPs then should be paid so much more, they save so much life. But I see a question there, sorry.
Thank you very much for an excellent debate, to all speakers and moderators. I have a question, regarding the asymmetries of information that was mentioned earlier, both in the supply and in the demand. Basically, transparency in the calculations of all the value added on one side, and also the transparency in the willingness to pay of the players in the second market. And supply needs to meet demand, and demand needs to meet supply in order to get equilibrium, so we have a problem and we have to solve it. Now, my question is regarding this distrust and regarding the evolution of this distrust in both sides of the market in the last years. So I'd like to know how to conceive or how to see the evolution of this distrust, if we are getting closer or actually we are getting apart. How do you see what's going on in the last years?
I don't know, Fabienne, are we getting closer apart? Is the trust becoming so much bigger?
Thank you for the question. And maybe I could add just a comment to make the links with the question and the last comment you just made. Yeah, the willingness to pay depends on what the knowing of what you're going to pay. And it's for this reason it's very important to make a very good assessment of the real progress, the products made for the disease, and so even if you think everything equal, it's not so easy to have this information without a very strong assessment process that we try to have in every country in Europe, and we try to have jointly with this new regulation. And as soon as you know exactly what you're going to buy, I mean in terms of quality, you have a better, negotiation if you need to go to the price. And so to just answer to your question about trust, I think I come back to the transparency. I think as soon as you just let know every step of the process at everyone, as soon as you put in the boat every person who have to know about that, even the users, even the user that do not have exactly, the habits to know about medicines, things about, very technical point with the appraisal we made and with the assessment. I think you're going to gain some trust from the public, from the society, and it's going to be better to use the products at the end. And of course, the crisis with COVID and vaccines have learned this very strongly. I think we have a big path to do again. It's not, we are not gaining all the trust we need in this system. It's for this reason we have in our institution a very big reflection and action with users in general that we put in the board of the assessment of the discussion, and we hope to gain more trust with this process.
Right. I know that Thomas wants to read, but how much time do we have? Because we got to the end, right? We started a little bit late, so we have now taken. So I think we'll probably stop it there. Just if you could have one word, each of you, one word that you want to leave everybody here. Thomas, I'll start with you. Just one word.
Wow, one word.
More than one.
That's more than one. No, but I want to say that just to build on that, the way to build this trust is to have the long-term commitment from both the industry and public partners.
Sorry, I'm getting Frank.
About trust specifically?
Trust? No, one word that you want the panel to remain.
How about one sentence? And my one sentence is, there really do seem to be differences in opinion about clinical added value. I'm looking at the slide about market access in France.
They don't succeed.
What percent of drugs in France get have a high rating, very, very small, right? 3% or something like that. Whereas in the United States with the FDA, they have something called priority review, where they think it is an important, and something like 40% of drugs get priority review. So I've often wondered about that.
All right, more than one word. Let's see, Jorge, thank you so much.
It's a good negotiator, right?
Yeah.
Okay, it's important that value is measured and that the price is related to value.
Price related to value, okay, and Fabienne.
Hope for a joint Europe assessment, very strong and very trusty for the future.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks for your patience with me that we are going on. But